Welcome back to Mighty Habits. I'm Steven. And, we talk a lot on this show about building good habits to improve our lives. A big part of that is what we eat. Food is so important for our health and well-being. So today we're going to do a deep dive into the world of food systems. We're going to explore some common assumptions about where our food comes from and how those ideas became so popular, and maybe challenge a few of them along the way. Now, you might be thinking, food systems? That sounds kind of boring, but trust me, this is going to be juicy. We're going to uncover some surprising truths about the food we eat and how it gets to our plates. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a new perspective on what it means to make healthy and sustainable food choices. So are you ready to dig in? All right, let's get started. One of the things that always fascinates me is how certain ideas about food become so widespread, like the belief that local and organic is always better, or that we should all be striving for a plant-based diet. These ideas are everywhere, from social media to documentaries to even our own kitchens. But where do they come from, and are they really as straightforward as they seem? That's what I'm hoping to unpack today. I want to understand how these ideas took root in our culture and what the implications are for our food choices. Sometimes I feel like I'm walking through a grocery store on a moral tightrope. Every decision feels weighted with ethical and environmental implications. Should I buy the organic strawberries, or are they just a marketing gimmick? Is it better to get the imported avocados or the ones from California? And don't even get me started on the meat aisle. It's enough to make your head spin. So I think it's important to take a step back and examine these ideas with a critical eye, not to dismiss them outright, but to understand their origins, their nuances, and maybe even their limitations. Because the truth is, our food system is incredibly complex. There's no easy answers or one-size-fits-all solutions, and I think that's where the real learning begins. When we embrace the complexity and start asking tough questions, questions about the environmental impacts of different farming practices, the labor conditions of food workers, the role of technology in agriculture, and even the cultural and political forces that shape our food choices. It's a lot to unpack.
But I'm excited to dive in and see what we can discover. And hopefully, along the way, we can all learn something new about how to make more informed and thoughtful decisions about the food we eat. All right, so let's start by talking about this idea of voting with your fork. The concept that our individual food choices can make a difference in the world. It's a powerful idea, and it's definitely inspired a lot of people to be more conscious consumers. But is it really as simple as it sounds? Can we really change the food system one grocery basket at a time? I'm not so sure. And that's where I'm hoping our deep dive today can shed some light. We're going to explore the origins of this idea, the factors that contribute to its popularity, and the potential pitfalls of relying solely on individual consumer choices to drive systemic change. And to help me navigate this complex landscape, I've got a fantastic expert joining me today, someone who's been studying food systems for years and has a deep understanding of the issues at play. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm really looking forward to picking your brain on this. One of the things that I find really interesting is how the idea of voting with your fork has become so intertwined with this vision of small-scale localized agriculture. It's like there's this romantic notion that the solution to our food system woes lies in going back to a simpler time, when farmers markets were the norm and everyone knew where their food came from.
Yeah, it's definitely a compelling narrative, and it's easy to see why it appeals to so many people. I mean, who wouldn't want to live in a world where food is fresh, local, and grown with care? But I think it's important to remember that this vision is often idealized. The reality of small-scale farming is a lot more complex and nuanced than what we often see portrayed in the media. There are challenges with labor scalability, distribution, and even the environmental impacts of certain farming practices. So while I think supporting local farmers is a great thing to do, I also think we need to be realistic about the limitations of this model
Mm.
and be open to exploring other solutions as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. It's easy to get caught up in the romance of it all, but we need to be careful not to oversimplify the issue. Because like you said, the reality is much more complex. So I guess the question is, if voting with your fork isn't the silver bullet solution to our food system problems, what are some other approaches we should be considering? What are some of the systemic changes that need to happen in order to create a truly sustainable and equitable food system?
Well, I think one of the key things is to shift our focus from individual choices to collective action. We need to start thinking about food as a public good, something that we all have a right to access. And that means advocating for policies that support sustainable agriculture, like investing in research and development, promoting agroecological practices, and providing financial incentives for farmers to adopt more environmentally friendly methods.
I think that's a really important point. It's easy to feel like our individual choices are all we have. But we need to remember that we also have a voice in shaping public policy, and that our collective action can have a much greater impact than our individual choices alone.
Exactly. And I think another important piece of the puzzle is addressing the issue of food justice, making sure that everyone has access to healthy, affordable food, regardless of their income or where they live. This means tackling issues like food deserts, which are areas where access to fresh produce is limited, and supporting programs like SNAP and subsidized housing, which can help ensure that low-income families have enough to eat.
It sounds like we're talking about a pretty fundamental shift in
Yeah.
how we think about food.
Yeah, I think so. It's about moving away from this idea that food is just a commodity and recognizing that it's something that's essential to our health, our well-being, and our sense of community.
I think a lot of people are already starting to embrace this idea. We're seeing a growing movement towards food sovereignty, which is the right of people to define their own food and agricultural systems, and to produce healthy and culturally appropriate food in a way that's ecologically sound and socially just.
Absolutely. I think this is a really exciting development because it's about reclaiming our power over our food systems and creating a future where food is a source of nourishment, connection, and empowerment for everyone.
That's a great note to end on. So much food for thought already. And we're just getting started. We'll be right back after a short break. And when we return, we'll delve deeper into some of the specific challenges and solutions related to creating a more sustainable and equitable food system. So stay tuned. So, we've been talking about this idea of voting with your fork and how it relates to the bigger picture of food systems. And you shared some really interesting stuff about how maybe it's not as simple as just choosing the right products.
Yeah, definitely. Like, it's great to support local farmers and make conscious choices, but the materials you gave me really point out that those individual actions might not be enough on their own. It's like we need to look deeper at the whole system,
Yeah.
you know?
Right, because I was thinking about how popular that phrase is, like vote with your fork. But if we're only focused on those individual choices, are we missing out on some bigger changes that need to happen?
That's exactly what these sources are suggesting. Like, they talk about this idea of a libertarian fantasy around food, where we think we can just opt out of the industrial system and create this perfect little world of sustainable farms.
So it's not enough to just buy from the right places.
Right. It's way more complicated than that. Like, our food system is so interconnected, and there are all these factors like agricultural subsidies and policies that favor big industrial farms.
So where do we go from there?
Well, the sources highlight a few key areas where we need to look deeper. Like, one thing they bring up is labor practices. We have this image of small farms being all idyllic, but sometimes those workers are exploited or they rely heavily on unpaid family labor.
Yeah, it's easy to forget about the people behind the food.
Exactly. And another big question is scalability. Like, small farms are great, but can they really feed the whole world?
Right, because you need so much land and resources.
And that kind of leads to the role of technology. The sources argue that we should be more open to new technology in agriculture to make things more sustainable.
So instead of looking back at the past, we should be thinking about the future of food production.
That's what they seem to be saying. Like, we tend to think older methods are better, but maybe technology can help us produce food more efficiently and with less waste.
That's an interesting perspective.
And they also talk about how focusing on small farms might not help people in cities who don't have access to farmers markets.
Which is a huge problem, especially in areas with limited access to fresh food.
Exactly. And so the sources suggest that we need to shift our focus from individual choices to things like government regulations and policy changes.
So instead of telling people what to buy, it's about making the healthier and more sustainable choices easier for everyone.
Right, like stricter rules on things like pesticides, factory farming, and labor standards.
It's about creating a system where the good choices are the accessible choices. And that feels like a big shift from focusing on individual responsibility to a more collective approach.
And another solution they emphasize is strong social safety nets, like programs that help people afford healthy food no matter their income.
So it's a multi-pronged approach, addressing issues on different levels.
Yeah. And maybe the most important thing they highlight is a shift in our cultural norms around food.
What do you mean by that?
Well, they say we need to move away from this romantic view of small farms as the only solution and be open to new ideas, like thinking critically about where our food comes from, who produces it, and what the real costs are.
So it's about being more informed and challenging our assumptions.
Exactly. It's about understanding the complexity of the issue.
This is all really eye-opening. It feels like we need to move beyond these simple solutions and really dig into the heart of the problem.
Absolutely. And I think that's where the real work begins.
This is giving me a lot to think about in terms of my own food choices and how I can contribute to a more sustainable and equitable food system.
And that's what it's all about, starting with awareness and then taking action.
This has been incredibly insightful. I'm definitely feeling inspired to be a more conscious consumer.
That's great to hear.
It sounds like a lot of what we need to do is, like you said, shift our thinking away from individual choices and towards, like broader solutions. So I'm curious, are there any other countries that are kind of ahead of the game in terms of creating these more sustainable and equitable food systems?
Yeah, actually, the materials you shared mentioned that a lot of other countries are already doing some interesting things. Like some European countries have much stricter regulations on pesticides and GMOs than we do here. And they've also put a lot of effort into things like public transportation and urban planning to make it easier for people to get fresh food.
So it seems like there are models out there that we could learn from.
Right, exactly. Like instead of trying to come up with everything from scratch, we can look at what's working in other places and adapt it to our own situation. Obviously, every country is different, but there's a lot we can learn from each other.
That's encouraging to hear. So I guess what you're saying is that this deep dive has really kind of challenged that idea, voting with your fork as like the main solution. It's more about looking at the whole system.
Yeah, exactly. Like individual choices matter, but they're only one piece of the puzzle. If we really want to create a food system that's good for people and the planet, we need to think bigger. It's about collective action policy changes and even shifting our cultural norms around food.
So knowing what we know now about how complex this all is, what are some key things we should consider when we're making choices about what to eat?
I think the most important thing is to be informed and critical consumers. Like, ask questions about where your food comes from, how it's produced, and what the impact is on the environment and the workers. And remember that our choices as individuals are limited. Real change requires us to work together to push for bigger systemic changes, like supporting policies that promote sustainable agriculture, holding corporations accountable for their practices, and advocating for a more just and equitable food system.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation. I feel like I've learned so much about the challenges and the possibilities of our food systems.
I'm glad to hear that.
And to all our listeners out there, I hope this deep dive has inspired you to think more deeply about the food you eat and how you can be part of creating a more sustainable and equitable food future. Thanks for listening.